All right, well, thank you so much for coming. So all landscapes are heterogeneous to a certain extent, and variation in the abiotic and biotic conditions that species experience across their range can favor the evolution of local adaptation. And this pattern has been documented in a diversity of organisms ranging from the more mobile to the less mobile. Reciprocal transplant experiments provide really powerful tests of local adaptation, and they often reveal that local genotypes or ecotypes have a fitness advantage over foreign genotypes in a given environment. However, these patterns of local adaptation are not ubiquitous, and indeed a variety of evolutionary processes, including gene flow, can swamp out locally adapted alleles and result in local maladaptation. Now, while the pattern of local adaptation has been documented extensively over the past 80 or so years, we know much less about the processes that contribute to local adaptation. So this is really where the field is going. How do various environmental agents of selection interact to contribute to the evolution of local adaptation? And that's a particularly important question when we consider that most organisms do not grow simply in two discrete environments, but rather grow across a range of environmental conditions. So reciprocal transplant experiments have done an excellent job documenting adaptation to contrasting environments, but most species span a gradient. And we know much less about how local adaptation proceeds when gene flow and other evolutionary processes can influence local selective factors. We know even less about how climate change might influence these dynamics. Now, you might imagine that climate change is imposing novel patterns of selection on previously locally adapted populations, and this could have really pronounced consequences for local adaptation and evolutionary dynamics going forward. And if we go back to some agents of selection that contribute to local adaptation, you can see that climate change can affect many of these. So we did a recent review in collaboration with David Lowery's lab where we were able to document that only 4 studies have actually identified putative causal agents of selection that contribute to these long-standing patterns of local adaptation. But you can imagine that any of these factors may be important selective agents and that they are interacting. And what climate change is doing is it's basically decoupling these previously correlated, reliable environmental factors, which could have really profound consequences, disrupting these long-standing patterns. So my lab is particularly interested in the evolutionary consequences of climate change. We'd like to know how climate change alters patterns of natural selection, whether it disrupts long-standing patterns of local adaptation, and what the contributions of phenotypic plasticity and gene flow are to climate change responses. We answer these questions across elevational gradients, which are really wonderful proxies for climate. In the Rocky Mountains where we work, we typically see hot and dry, low elevation locations grading up to cooler and moist, high elevation sites. So today what I'm going to really focus on is this question about whether climate change could disrupt local adaptation, essentially leading to populations that are no longer adapted to the local conditions that they experience, which could have really pronounced consequences for population dynamics. It could lead to further reductions in population size, and those reductions in population size could actually impede migration. We typically think of migration as maybe the most prominent response to climate change, but if populations continue to decline, they'll produce fewer seeds and pollen to migrate to new locations. So before we can address the evolutionary consequences of climate change, I need to first show you that there is local adaptation in this system. So the first part of the empirical part of the talk will be evaluating local adaptation to elevation, and then we'll address these questions of whether climate change might disrupt local adaptation. I do this work with Boechera stricta, which is this wonderful mustard that grows throughout the western United States. I love Boechera because it spans a really large climatic gradient. It can grow in latitudes as low as Utah and as high as Alaska, elevations as low as 700 meters and as high as 3,900 meters. And there are phylogeographic data to suggest that the species has been able to expand and contract its range in response to the Pleistocene glaciers, despite being a selfer that has the most boring mechanism of seed dispersal of anything I've ever worked on. It basically just opens its seeds and drops them. So it can respond to climate change on a geological time frame. And what we're interested in is how it will be responding to contemporary patterns of climate change. It's a short-lived perennial, and it's extremely experimentally tractable, meaning that we can outplant lots and lots of plants and interrogate fitness and phenotype under numerous environmental conditions. The work that I'll be showing you comes from sites around the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, where I'll be going on Sunday to plant next year's experiment. And since 2013, we've established 5 common gardens arrayed across an elevational gradient, basically from about 2,500 meters up to 3,300 meters. We planted some plants into those sites, and we've evaluated a variety of different fitness and phenotypic traits in this experiment. I'll mostly be showing you data today from this mid-elevation site that's in the center, and then we'll be expanding outward to some other locations later in the talk. But first, I want to show you that our fitness data are consistent with patterns of local adaptation. So what you're seeing here, each data point represents the mean of a family that we've planted into these locations. We've used families from across a really broad elevational gradient in a kind of provenance trial sort of approach. The elevation of origin of those families is on the x-axis. What you see, the red star, indicates the elevation of this particular garden. And we're looking at 3 different fitness components: germination success, survival, and fecundity. And in all of these cases, you can see patterns that are broadly consistent with local adaptation, where local genotypes have elevated fitness relative to higher elevation genotypes. So these are fitness data, but we can also evaluate phenotypic traits, including phenological variables, morphological variables, and ecophysiology, as variation in those traits may reflect long-standing evolutionary responses to a selective gradient, to differences in selection across this environmental gradient. So here we're looking at flowering phenology, which is a trait that's highly responsive, highly correlated with fitness. I'm showing you flowering phenology data in 2 gardens. We have a lot of data on phenological patterns, and these data basically show that high elevation genotypes flower early, they flower at a short stature, and they flower for short duration. And all of those traits could be an evolutionary response to a very short growing season that occurs in high elevation locations. So in those high elevation locations where the growing season is very short, there should be strong selection for rapid development. These genetically based clines have been corrected for neutral population structure as a way of trying to address whether they may actually be adaptive. I'll also show you water use efficiency, which we assessed via stable carbon isotopes. And here I've just mapped out the aridity index. This is just in 1 garden. This pattern is entirely consistent with our expectations, where we would expect higher water use efficiency from genotypes that evolved in arid environments, and less water use efficiency from these higher elevation, more moist environments. And again, this may reflect an evolutionary response to this aridity gradient, as these high elevation genotypes, the traits that enable water use efficiency are also traits that run counter to rapid development. So I mentioned that we corrected for neutral population structure to assess whether these are potentially adaptive. We actually did selection analyses as well. And what was really, really cool about these is in our system, at least in this data set, we can show that selection favors local trait values when we integrate across multiple episodes of selection. So I'm going to be showing you 3 traits here. This first trait is selection on size at flowering. And on the y-axis, I've indicated the local trait value. And in all 3 of the traits that I'm going to be showing you, height at flowering, water use efficiency, and specific leaf area, we see stabilizing selection when integrated across episodes of selection. And what's really exciting is that the peak of these quadratic fitness functions is very, very close to those local trait values. And this suggests that these genetic clines are adaptive. So I mentioned that Boechera is very boring in terms of biotic interactions, but it does have herbivores, which is great. So we can also address local adaptation to herbivory. And if there is local adaptation to herbivory, what we should expect across different gardens is that genotypes that evolved in elevation similar to the elevation of the garden should have reduced damage from insect herbivores. And we should see an increase in damage from insect herbivores in other locations that are farther from that particular garden. We see this pattern somewhat. In our lower elevation garden, there's clear evidence that the amount of leaf area removed increases with elevation of origin, but we see that same exact pattern in our higher elevation gardens. And in fact, this is one pattern that I see repeatedly across environments and across years of this study. And there is a genetic trade-off between rapid development and defense against insect herbivores. So what I think is going on is that strong selection for rapid development in high elevation locations is associated with more limited defensive traits against insect herbivores. There's not a very large insect herbivore population in those high elevation locations, and the traits that plants use to develop rapidly are also traits that make their leaves very delicious to herbivores, like high foliar nitrogen content. And in contrast, in the lower elevation sites, the plants need to retain their leaves for much longer, so they have to be better defended. So I hope that I've described to you, that I've convinced you that there's clinal variation in fitness and traits, and this is consistent with local adaptation. And what I'd like to do now is turn to local adaptation in the context of climate change. In high elevation and high latitude systems, climate change is profoundly altering winter dynamics. So this is observed in projected changes in winter climates in mountains in the western North America. Not surprisingly, we see increases in temperature, but we also see changes in snowfall and changes in snow depth. And essentially what's happening is that warming winter temperatures cause precipitation to fall more now as rain than as snow, so you don't see the banking of the snowbank that you used to see. And warming spring temperatures are accelerating the timing of snowmelt. So what I didn't tell you before is that we've actually been manipulating snowmelt across this elevational gradient. So this is one of our sites immediately before snow removal. This is at 10 days later, where you can see snow is melted out in those removal plots. And, early snow removal alters plant phenology, flowering phenology, germination phenology. It exposes plants to frosts that they never would have experienced before because they would have been insulated under a blanket of snow. And it decreases soil moisture. So we can look back at the fitness ramifications of this snow removal treatment, which is a really, really good way of simulating climate change in this region. I've already shown you fecundity data and how that varies with source elevation in this location. And this is what happens under the snow removal treatment. So what I want to point out two things here. First is that maladaptation becomes more pronounced under snow removal. We see a reduction in fitness across the board under snow removal. And even under control conditions, we see that low elevation families already have a fitness advantage over local families. So even in these control situations, being from a lower elevation site is advantageous. So we started to wonder whether climate change may already have disrupted local adaptation and shifted fitness functions in the system. So we actually started a snow removal experiment, snow addition experiment. And I'm going to just show you those data here. On the x-axis, we're looking at elevational difference. So I've only been showing you data from one garden at a time. We're now going to integrate across all 5 gardens. And the elevational difference is basically the difference in elevation between the source and the garden. So perfect local adaptation would be a quadratic fitness function with the peak at 0, because those are genotypes that evolved in a similar elevation as the elevation of the gardens that we've been looking at. And under snow removal and control, we see patterns that are consistent with the previous studies that we've done, where low elevation genotypes have a fitness advantage over local genotypes. So these fitness functions are shifted down from 0. So low elevation genotypes are outperforming local genotypes. But when we do this relatively simple snow addition manipulation, we can actually recreate patterns of local adaptation. And we see the pattern that we would expect under local adaptation, where this peak in germination success falls very close to 0. So we can create local adaptation or recreate local adaptation under snow addition. So just to summarize, we've seen clinal variation both in phenotypes and in fitness. This is consistent with local adaptation. And we may have seen that climate change has already altered fitness functions, shifting those functions lower in elevation, where maladaptation appears to arise under contemporary and snow removal treatments. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions later on in the day at a coffee break. And thank you for your attention.